This is Dr. Gary Kellner. Welcome to Fair Game. We are living in the midst of an explosion of anti-Semitism in our world. I'm not talking about Russia or France. I'm talking about the most venerable universities in America: Harvard, Columbia, University of Pennsylvania, and scores of other universities across this country. In the days immediately following the horrific massacre of people who were attending a music festival in southern Israel, a massacre that wiped out 1,250 men, women, and children, 250 more people were taken hostage, you would think that world sentiment would move toward the victim. Instead, across this country, on campus after campus, the chants were heard from the river to the sea: Palestine must be free. When you hear that the first time, it may not strike you for what it is. But behind that chant, we have to understand that there's a reality. It's the 7.1 million Jews who live between the river and the sea. And just exactly what is it that pro-Hamas crowd is calling for? The obliteration of those Jews. You say you're overreacting. Here's what I find interesting. Those chants began 24 hours after those attacks. Charges of war crimes by the Israeli Defense Force started being heard on those same university campuses 2 weeks before the IDF invaded Gaza. It was a carefully coordinated and constructed campaign that took place over 18 months to 2 years. What do we need to do about it? Can we do anything about it? For serious people, for good people, how shall we respond to the hideous rise of anti-Semitism in our own country and many of our own communities? There have been more acts of violence against Jews, more acts of violence against synagogues in the last 5 years than any comparable period in modern American history. This is not an isolated series of events. This is part of a broader trend. And this is what we have to talk about. A lot of people believe that the issue of anti-Semitism was resolved with the end of the Second World War and the destruction of the Nazi regime. And yet, Stalin took action against the Jews. There have been riots against the Jews in a variety of locations around the world. There are subtle forms of anti-Semitism that were practiced in this country in the 1940s. Jews need not apply for certain jobs or for membership in certain country clubs because those were perceived to be Gentile enclaves. What we see on October 7th is especially appalling, but the explosion of anti-Semitism in our world is even more concerning. A friend of mine was speaking at Massachusetts Institute of Technology a few weeks after the protests began. There are 700 Jewish students at MIT. Not one of them came to hear his lecture on anti-Semitism. When he asked why, He said they were afraid to leave their dorm rooms because they had been spat on, they had been harassed, they had been beaten up in America by American students. Now, just let that sink in for a moment. My friend, who is a big-hearted guy, asked one of the conveners if he would take him to the encampment. He wanted to see it. He wanted to talk to some of the protesters. And his host said, "Are you kidding? I'm not safe there." Well, Joe is a Vietnam War era veteran, and he doesn't have a lot of fear. He has good sense, but not a lot of fear. So he went on his own. And he talked to a college student who was carrying the placard, "From the river to the sea, Palestine must be free." He asked her what that meant to her. She couldn't tell him. He asked her to give him her understanding of the Palestinian issue. She couldn't do it. He asked her what she would do with 7 million Jews who live between the river and the sea. No, she never commented on that either. And he said in that moment he realized that those college students, for the most part, are being manipulated by professional agitators. Here's what we now know more than 2 years after the attacks. It was all planned and it was all coordinated. Within 24 hours of the attacks of October 7, the encampments started showing up on America's campuses, and they excoriated the Israeli Defense Force for war crimes. The IDF had not invaded the Gaza. It would not invade the Gaza for 2 more weeks. And yet, this persistent campaign of disinformation, which is a nice 21st century way of saying lies, this propaganda campaign designed to make the victim the victimizer, designed to make the victim the aggressor, went on. This may not seem like much of a problem to you. It may not be a problem in the town where you live in. But I'd like to roll tape back 90 years to Germany and the rise of the Nazi Party, that from its inception was anti-Semitic, which from its inception called for suppressing the Jews. Most Germans didn't worry about it. They saw the Nazis as a fringe group. They saw them as having small numbers. No one could imagine they'd ever take over the country, except the bottom fell out of the economy with the worldwide depression. And the Allies, after World War I, had put crippling reparations on Germany. And so Germany careened from one governmental crisis to the next. Hitler emerges as a compelling orator, as a man with a solution, and a convenient scapegoat, the Jews. But even then, most Germans, and certainly most Jews, didn't think this was a very serious problem. After all, Germany was the most liberal country in Europe. Germany had provided a home for the Jews for hundreds of years. The Jews didn't experience the same legal restrictions in Germany that they had in France. 1938, November, is called the Night of the Broken Glass, when Nazi thugs, stormtroopers, burned several hundred synagogues, destroyed Jewish-owned businesses, murdered Jewish citizens on the street. That was the beginning of what the Jews call the Shoah, what non-Jews call the Holocaust. Nobody believed it was possible in a place like Germany. Except, within 7 years, more than 6 million Jews, men, women, children, more than 1.5 million children, fell into the abyss of the Nazi night. In the late 40s, most people in the world said never again. And yet here we are. Anti-Semitism is in some of the citadels of learning in the United States of America, in such a liberal bastion as Harvard University. And the administrators say nothing. Well, they actually did. They were called to testify before Congress, and they were absolutely incoherent because they have no moral grounding. They had no moral overview. On the last Sunday of January, an organization called Eagle's Wings, a large network of Christians in the United States and in scores of other countries, joined together for what they call Solidarity Sunday. They actually opened the doors of the churches to Jewish speakers, to the Jewish community. They normally will have a rabbi or a distinguished Jewish leader in the community speak. And the Christians will pray for the Jews. And they commit themselves to a mission of resisting anti-Semitism wherever they find it, in whatever form they find it. And they commit themselves that this horror must not happen again. I've had the opportunity to work with the leadership of Eagle's Wings. I've known most of them for decades. They are serious people. They are people with a serious purpose. The founder and president of Eagle's Wings, Robert Stearns, is perhaps the foremost spokesperson in the world from the Christian community in his advocacy of Israel. 1938, when the Nazis began their campaign against the Jews in earnest in Germany, there were 18,000 churches. 3,000 of them joined the choir for Hitler and became known as the Reich Church, which is to say, they draped the cross with the Nazi swastika. The most hideous commingling of symbols in human history. If the cross symbolizes God's love and his commitment to redeem the human race, the swastika represented everything that is evil and every attempt to destroy human dignity. 1938, 3,000 churches joined a choir. Another 3,000 churches stood up and said, "We cannot allow this to happen." 12,000 churches said nothing and did nothing. You know, they had a board meeting that month. They had things on the church calendar. Churches shouldn't get mixed up in politics. Well, As a rule, that might be true. But as one pastor, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, said, if a lunatic is driving an automobile at 60 miles an hour through a playground filled with children, are you not obligated to stop the car? He believed he was obligated. And there were a few pastors, less than 20%, who committed themselves to resisting the Nazi tyranny. Bonhoeffer started a breakaway group from the Lutheran Church, which said nothing and did nothing, that he called the Confessing Church. It's primarily young seminarians and young pastors who saw the deadly threat of Nazism for what it was. They met in small groups. They discipled people in their churches. Many of them went to prison. Bonhoeffer himself was part of the plot to kill Hitler that nearly succeeded in July of 1944. Some folks find that appalling. How could a Christian pastor do such a thing? Well, when he looked at that car careening through the playground, he saw that Austrian corporal behind the steering wheel. For him, there was no choice. I would suggest to you today that if there was ever a time that Christians need to stand with their Jewish neighbors, with their Jewish friends, with their Jewish colleagues, today is that day. And one of his most frequently quoted comments of the period, Bonhoeffer said, "Silence in the face of evil is evil itself." Let's not pretend that we can sit this out. Let's not pretend that what Hamas does or Hezbollah does or the terrorist state of Iran does has nothing to do with us. Folks, in this world, we will get what we are willing to tolerate. If we are willing to tolerate a rabid anti-Semitism, if we are willing to tolerate tyranny, let me assure you, there are enough bad players in this world that it is possible to turn America into 1938 Germany. This is Dr. Gary Kellner, and this is Fair Game.